Right, folks, for this next assignment, you are going to be using the techniques that you've learned through your use of creating scratch boards, specifically your hatching, your cross-hatching, and your scrumbling. You're going to be using those mark-making techniques to create a dry point etching. Now, what a dry point etching is, it's a very, very traditional style of printmaking that dates back to the late 1400s. So we're talking over 500 years. Artists have been creating dry point etching. And what dry point etching, what really spurred it on, or what caused dry point etching to come to the forefront of the printmaking process, was all spurred on by the printing press. So you've got in northern Italy, you've got the beginning of the High Renaissance in the late 1400s, when the printing press was invented. And with the printing press, all of a sudden, the humans had the ability to be able to make books, to print the printed word in a way that was quick, that didn't require the author to hand write or hand pen every word. It was a process where books and manuscripts could be recreated relatively quickly. And once this technology hit, artists wanted to get in on this, and bookmakers wanted to have artists' work to be able to be easily reprinted and reproduced as illustrations inside of the books. That's really the big thing that got dry point and etching in general to become an artistic process that artists used all across Europe and eventually all around the world. Traditionally, dry point was done on very, very thin, flat sheets of tin. And what the artist would do is they would use a dry point needle, very, very similar to the needles that you've been using in creating your scratch boards in previous lessons, where the artist would just go in and would use those dry points to go in and scratch into the surface of the metal. So you can see here all of these lines. You can look at all the cross hatching. Look at the scrumbling you've got back in the back. Look at the hatch marks that are coming through. All of those traditional mark making techniques that you've already practiced on, you can see those on this particular dry point print. So the artist goes in and scratches their design into their metal plate, and what that does is it creates a rough edge or a burr. The burr is basically the shredded metal, or in the case of what you're going to be doing, shredded plexiglass, where the drawing is literally scratched into the surface, and then you go in with your ink and you paint that onto the areas that have been scratched in, and then you polish it clean. When you go and you polish it clean, that leaves the clear areas of the plate that haven't been touched by the burr. That is going to be cleaned up, but every place else where you've created that burr and those scratch marks are going to be filled in with ink, and then you use that plate to go through and create your prints. Modern day times, I have done dry point on both zinc, I've done some dry point on copper plates, and I've done a bunch of dry point on plexiglass. So any hard surface that you can easily scratch into is a really, really good surface that you can use in order to create your dry point plates. So the very, very first artist to ever use dry point printing we don't even know his name. He was a German artist that is referred to today as the house book master, and he was called the house book master because over the course of about 5 to 7 years, at the end of the 15th century, he made a series of 91 prints that he put together into a book and then had that book printed over and over and over again. Now, the problem with dry point printing, as you'll see as we get into the history of bookmaking and the history of illustrations printed in books, specifically with the house book master, the main problem with dry point printing is the more and more you print with it, the quicker the burrs that you have created in the etching process are going to get worn down and aren't going to hold that ink. So you're, in all honesty, with Drypoint, you are really, really lucky if you can lift over 20 prints off of the same plate before things start to degrade down. So when you look at both of these illustrations, these are both done by the housebook master in his house book that he printed himself. There's lots of stuff here that you can see shows the time and the place. So in the illustration over on the right, you can definitely see that beginning of the background, middle ground, foreground placement and proportion coming through, but things are definitely flattened out in the illustration. This is that perfect time in art history when the medieval art traditions are being replaced with the Renaissance, where the artists are trying to get that sense of realism to come through. What's really, really beautiful about Drypoint printing is once you print, this is the basic print that you can see over on the right, where all of the black areas are brought through in the printing process. Once you get your etching all printed out, you can go over the top of that etching with watercolor paint in order to create different colors and tones to come through. These are some of the first examples of Drypoint prints that have ever been made, and there's relatively few examples of these left. It was documented that the housebook master made 90 different prints, and of those 90 different prints, he put those together to create about 30 books that over the course of 500 years have been absolutely lost. And this is the biggest problem with Drypoint printing, is it's good for reproduction, and it feels, for the artist, it really, really feels like you're going in and you're using basic drawing techniques to create your prints. But the problem is, the more and more you print off of the plates, the more the plates degrade, and it became very, very evident that Drypoint printing, while at the very beginning of the process of using it for illustrations, wasn't something that was going to allow bookmakers or artists to create hundreds or thousands of prints. You'd be lucky if you got 2 or 3 dozen prints before the plate starts to degrade down. So by the beginning to mid 1500s, so we get into the 16th century, other etching processes started to take the forefront, specifically going in and carving into harder materials like copper instead of tin. That definitely helped. Carving or doing Drypoint into hard woods, that was another process that allowed the burr to hold on longer. But once we get into the mid-1500s, there's the process of etching started to use more acids, more sulfuric acids that ate into the hard metals. That created not a burr, but an actual carving or an indentation that allowed artists to create hundreds to thousands of prints off of those same plates. So in a relatively short time of about 50 years, Drypoint printing became obsolete. The technology caught up to it to the point of where artists felt that there were other ways to be able to lift their prints for illustration that would allow them to reproduce those images over and over and over again without that degradation of the plate, without having the plate fall apart. Wasn't until the 1600s, with the famous Dutch artist named Rembrandt, that you started to see a big resurgence in the Drypoint process. So from the early to mid 1500s to the mid 1600s, it was about 100 years where Drypoint really wasn't being used because there were so many other printmaking processes that made more sense. Rembrandt came into the scene and became what is known as the father of Drypoint because he was an absolute master. Remember, Rembrandt was a part of the Baroque art movement. Rembrandt was best known for creating portraits that, unlike the style and tradition of the Renaissance art, with the Baroque, it was more focused on very, very hard, direct, high contrast lighting. But even more important, Rembrandt was most famous for creating artwork that showed expression, that showed emotion, that wasn't stoic. Rembrandt was the artist of the Baroque era that really humanized the process of creating art. So what Rembrandt did with his dry points is he used these specifically as studies, specifically as ways to plan out future paintings. What Rembrandt really did to make the process of dry point so important is how he polished his plates to create a sense of atmosphere in the work that he did. These are some copper plates that Rembrandt used. He went in, this is not using any acid whatsoever. This is all dry point directly on. Now, when you look at this, what's so beautiful about Rembrandt's dry point, you've got all of the mark making that's coming through, but you can also see in these dark areas, in these gray areas, in these light areas, places where he didn't go in and wipe all of the ink away. The only places that are polished on the plate are the white areas completely. All of these areas that are gray that doesn't have as many mark making processes, like in the body of the Christ, there's not a whole lot of hatch marks coming through, but he still has that gray because he's finding that balance in the polishing of the plate itself. He's using the ink as a part of his artistic process. So if he had gone in and polished this plate completely, what would have happened is you would have had a line drawing. But by going in and leaving some of the ink still around in areas, he's creating a sense of mood, value, and atmosphere. Here's another one of Rembrandt's pieces. Look at the beautiful hatch marks and cross hatching. Look at that sense of light that he has coming through. But all most important is how he's layering up all of these different areas of ink. One last one by Rembrandt. I love this piece because it absolutely highlights. You can see all in this area where the light is coming in and hitting the Christ, where you have the light coming in and illuminating these figures at the back. All of these sections in here are completely and fully polished. But the further back you go, especially with the halo coming around the Christ, especially in the building back in the back, you can see that he's got a very, very delicate hand in how he's lifting up the ink. This is how he's using this ink more in a painterly mode versus a strict clean printmaking mode. Really, really beautiful work. As we get further into modern art and the modern day, to the turn of the 20th century all the way until today, there are a bunch of artists that especially at the turning of the 20th century, there were a bunch of artists that started to turn back to dry point. So remember, with printmaking, the purpose behind printmaking for artists is for them to be able to recreate many, many different versions of the same image over and over and over again. That really echoed, especially in the 1700s, moving into the 1800s with photography, this idea that art should be accessible to everybody. Everybody, like, regardless of your socioeconomic status, everybody wanted to have some piece of artwork in their house because it showed culture, it showed status, it showed wealth to a certain extent. If you were able to afford a drawing or an etching or a photograph, that showed a certain social status that other people didn't necessarily have. So what did this mean for artists? For a long time, artists were all about this idea of going in and cranking out hundreds and hundreds of prints. And what there was a movement in the art world where artists started to feel that if you would go in and if you could make a drawing and just recreate it hundreds and hundreds of times, that would flood the market. It would, by having hundreds and hundreds of prints, what it would do is it would actually cheapen the value of the artwork. So at the turn of the 20th century, there were a bunch of artists that went, hey, we want to make prints, but we don't want to make hundreds of prints. And we don't want other people in the future after we die to be able to take our plates and reproduce those. So the Drypoint printing process was a perfect solution to this. For artists to be able to go, I'm going to come in and I'm going to create a Drypoint design, and I'm only going to be able to lift 20, maybe 30 prints from this plate, and then it'll be done. That put a cap on the number of prints that were made. And if the artists were the actual ones to go in and put their hands on it and print them themselves, to only have 30 prints of one design that the artist was the actual one that printed, that actually increased the value of the artwork. So it turned these prints into collectibles. It turned these prints into almost like baseball cards. If you've got number one of the first print of an edition of 30 Drypoints, and you've got the number one, that is going to be worth a bunch of money, especially when the artist made it. So here you've got different examples. Here is a Drypoint done by Vincent van Gogh. Here is a Drypoint that was done in 1932 by Pablo Picasso. You have another Pablo Picasso. You have a Marie Cassatt, a famous French artist, one of the first female artists of the 20th century that got great renown. And then you've got more modern plexiglass versions. The process of Drypoint has changed numerous times over the years. Once again, look at how this artist came in and used the ink to create a sense of atmosphere to come through. More pieces, just more modern versions of different ways that you can use Drypoint to create your illustrations. Now, what does this mean for you? So for the assignment that you are going to be working on, in the Google Classroom, the explanation of the assignment is out. You are going to be creating a design in Drypoint where you are going to illustrate the folk tale, the nursery rhyme, the myth, the legend, some big epic story from the past that you are going to recreate and illustrate much in the same way as the first Drypoint printers did. Now, in the example that I have in front of me here is the beginning of the illustration that you can see that I am doing from the Brothers Grimm fairy tale called Iron John. Iron John is a fairy tale that talks about hunters that would go off into the wilderness and would never come back. All of the men of this German village would go into the forest to hunt, and they'd never return. And the king of this time was very concerned by this, so he sent his best huntsmen out into the forest. And what he found was the men that went into this forest encountered the Iron John. Iron John was the masculine spirit of the forest. And so this fairy tale is really asking the question, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to have masculinity? And how does that change for a man when they are in society versus out into the wild? So this is the beginning of my process of creating this illustration. first thing that you should notice is I've got my roots that are coming out of the beard over on the bottom left-hand side, but when you look at the illustration, those roots are on or when you look at the actual print, those roots are over on the right-hand side. So this is a reversal process. You are going to create your design in your plexiglass, and when you print it out, the left side is going to end up being on the right side, just like you did, just another consideration that you'll have to take into account, just like you did with your block printing. Now, what this process looks like, I'm putting this down on a white piece of paper so you can see the contrast of how the design comes through a little bit better. But when you really look at the plexiglass plate, when you get in up close, all of these lines, here, listen, all of these lines are scratched directly into the plexiglass. So what you're going to have to do, the very, very first step for you is to get one of the clear blank plexiglass plates that we have. Remember, these plexiglass plates have a clear sheet of plastic as a protective barrier over the top of the plexiglass. You can leave that clear sheet of paper on until you are ready to start the etching process. What I want you to do is to get one of the sheets of paper that are with the plexiglass, and you're going to go in and you're just going to frame this out. You're going to take one of those sheets of paper with your plexiglass, and you'll go ahead and draw the frame so you know exactly how large this is. Now, the process from here on out, you're going to go and do your planning process. You can start with a 2-inch pencil if you want to begin to get the design down onto your piece of paper. When you go through and once your design is sketched in, you're going to use your Sharpie pen to go in and put your hatch marks and cross hatching down into your design. You're going to use pen and ink to actually create your design on this piece of paper first, and then once your design is done and created, and I'll be honest, I had a design drawn up for this that I was going to show you, but I lost it. You guys know me at this point. That design is probably going to show up in about 2 weeks, and I'll go, oh man, here it is, and it'll be all good. But for right now, we're just going to use the imagination and the theater of the mind for you to figure that out. So let's say you're doing a illustration of Hansel and Gretel, and you want to do the old witch's house in the forest, all made of different sweets. You would draw this out using pen and ink first, and then once your design is completed, you'll go in and you'll tape this down, and then using either the Drypoint needles that you used for your scratchboard process, or I've got some of these awls that you will be able to use as well. You will go in and just start scraping and scratching directly into the surface of your plexiglass to get ready for the printmaking itself. I will demonstrate how to lift a print off of your Drypoint plates at the beginning of next week. Your job for this week is to get your design of your fairy tale put down onto your piece of paper, shaded in, showing me a full range of values, showing me hatching, cross-hatching, and scrumbling, and bonus points if you give me a background, middle ground, and foreground into your design. You are permitted to illustrate any point of any story that you want. It could be a mythological story, it could be an old fairy tale, it could be an old nursery rhyme, whatever's clever, man. Whatever you feel like is a theme or a story that you would enjoy to take a swing at and reinterpret it. I want to see your creative vision. I want to see your creative process. Don't just go in and copy another illustration that has been done by somebody else prior. Reimagine it. Reimagine your version of Alice in Wonderland. Reimagine your version of the story of Hercules and Medusa. You have the freedom to go in whatever direction you want with this. Your first sketches are due on Friday of this week.